I used to believe that if I behaved, stayed out of trouble, got good grades, and never disappointed anyone, then I would be loved, or at the very least, accepted. But I was wrong. When I was 20, my father called me out to the front porch. It was a heavy, humid September afternoon in a quiet suburb of New Jersey. The air felt thick, like it already knew something was about to break. He didn't yell. He wasn't even angry. He just said, "You've shamed this family enough, Savannah. Pack your things and don't come back." That was it. No argument, no tears, just a sentence, cold and final. My mother didn't come out. She stood behind the screen door, placing a cloth bag on the porch. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, my sketchbook, and a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in foil. It wasn't a goodbye. It was guilt, dressed up as kindness. No one hugged me. No one asked, "Where will you go?" Just silence. I sat in a circle with strangers, some covered in tattoos, others with shaking hands, sharing things that would have gotten them disowned in the world I came from. They weren't performing pain. They weren't asking for pity. They just spoke, calmly, bravely. And for the first time in so long, I didn't feel invisible. That night, I pulled out a pair of scissors. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and cut my hair short. Not out of crisis, but because I was ready to shed the shadow, the one they built from expectations and control. Each strand that fell into the sink felt like an old story being severed. The next morning, I applied for a local mural project. I didn't expect to get picked, but I did. Every brushstroke on that rough brick wall was a piece of me reclaiming myself. The girl they tried to erase, now coming back to life, through color, through hands, through heart. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post it online. But every day people walked by, and they saw, not my name, but me, in shapes, in shades, in a story without words. And somehow, that was enough. It was a beginning, a tiny crack in the shell I once thought I'd never escape. I don't remember exactly what day it was after I left home. Everything blurred together like smoke. Sleepless nights, makeshift meals, rushed conversations with strangers who never asked twice. But I remember clearly the first time someone truly listened to me. It was a cloudy Friday afternoon in Pittsburgh, as grey and damp as ever. After a shift at the corner store, I stopped by the community centre for a free meal, hot soup and grilled cheese. My plan was to eat quickly and leave. But then I heard the soft strum of an acoustic guitar coming from a room down the hall. I paused. Inside, a small group sat in a circle. No stage, no lights. Just people, each holding something. A guitar, a notebook, or an object they believed had once saved them. A silver-haired woman named Angela waved me in. She didn't ask where I came from, didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't belonged anywhere for a while. She just said, "Have you ever written something just for yourself?" I nodded, cautiously. She smiled. "Then tonight, if you feel like it, read it out loud. No one here will judge you." I didn't read, not that night. But I stayed, and I listened. There was a young man who had survived addiction, telling us about the first time he painted something not for money, but for peace. A trans woman read a diary entry about the ache of no longer being called by her real name. And a war veteran sang a song with no words, just melody and pain, wrapped in silence. And I sat there stunned. For the first time in a long time, I realized silence can heal if it's filled with presence. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back. No one asked my real name, and I didn't need them to. Here, I was V, the girl who painted murals, scribbled broken lines in a thrifted notebook, who once slept on a park bench but hadn't given up on herself. One night, after most of the group had left, Angela walked over and gently touched the notebook resting in my lap. "Have you ever thought," she asked, "that your voice might help someone else?" I shook my head, because for most of my life, my voice had only brought trouble, rebellion, rejection, and exile. She continued, "We're looking for a volunteer translator for new immigrants. They don't speak English, and they're terrified of losing the only place they've ever hoped to call home." I don't know why I nodded. Maybe it was her eyes, so sincere, so steady. Or maybe, for the first time, someone saw me as part of the solution, not the problem. My first day at the shelter, I was nervous. No one forced me to do anything. I just sat beside a woman from Mexico, trying to read her court papers. Her hands trembled, her eyes were red and tired. She kept repeating the same 3 words. Mi hija, mi hija, mi hija. My daughter. I saw myself in her eyes. I didn't understand all the Spanish, but I understood desperation. I knew what it felt like to be separated from love. To stand at a door the whole world had locked shut. I reached for her hand, and with slow English, soft eyes, and every ounce of compassion I had, I said, "We'll figure this out. You're not alone." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't a shadow anymore. I started learning Spanish, still worked mornings as usual. But in the evenings, I translated forms, helped fill out documents, and searched for legal aid groups who could fight for women like her. No one paid me, but I was paid in something far more valuable: trust. A month later, I was offered a part-time assistant role at the non-profit. Angela ran the Open Hands Project. I made coffee, sorted files, answered phones. But more than that, whenever someone needed help, I showed up. And in those narrow hallways, I began learning a new language, the language of wordless courage. One evening, as I stayed late organizing case folders, Angela placed a thick packet in front of me. She said, "It's a community leadership training program, not required. But if you want, you could be more than just behind the scenes." I took the folder, hands slightly shaking. Not out of fear, but because I wasn't used to anyone believing in me before I proved myself. That night, I went home, opened my notebook, and wrote, "Back then, all I wanted was to survive. Now, I want to help others keep living in ways they were never allowed to before." It was an early spring morning in Pittsburgh, with a soft mist still clinging to the rooftops, when I got an email from the Open Hands Project. The subject line was simple: "Would you like to speak for them?" Angela didn't write much, but I understood right away. Next week, there would be a public hearing at City Hall. The topic: budget cuts to legal aid services for undocumented immigrants. Among those affected were people I knew: the mother who once wept over her deportation papers, the 7-year-old boy I had helped sound out his first English words, and hundreds more suspended on the fragile line between the right to live and being quietly erased. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a seasoned activist. I was just a girl once cast aside by her own family. But I knew what it felt like to have no one stand up for you. And this time, I chose not to stay silent. Angela helped me prepare. We practiced each word, refined every breath. She was patient, steady, believing in me like doubt never existed. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, looking down at the sleeping street, remembering the nights I had once spent on a bench, not knowing if I'd even survive the week. Back then, I couldn't imagine a day when I would stand for someone else, let alone for an entire community. The next morning, I put on the only white button-down I owned. No makeup, no heels, just me, bare, honest, and enough. The hearing room was packed, every seat taken. People stood along the walls, some sitting cross-legged on the floor. In front sat the city officials in suits, sharp eyes, polished words. Behind me sat the people I'd once touched, with my eyes, with my hands, with my heart. They held no signs. They shouted no slogans. They simply waited to see if someone would speak for them. I stepped up. Standing at the microphone, my hands trembled slightly, but my voice did not. My name is V. I'm not a lawyer, not a politician. I'm someone who was once cast out by her own family for daring to live truthfully. And I'm here not to tell my story, but theirs. I spoke of a mother separated from her 3-year-old daughter because a single form went unsigned. I told them about a boy who lost his father because no attorney was there to file a simple extension. I didn't use big words. I just spoke from what I had seen, from what I had lived. The room fell silent. Then a man in a grey suit, somewhere in the middle row, leaned forward and asked, "V, do you believe continuing this service is realistic, with budgets running dry?" I looked straight at him. I didn't blink. "I think the least realistic thing we can do is expect a community to thrive while we silence its most vulnerable voices." The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, and then applause. Not thunderous, but real. The council didn't make a final decision that day, but I knew something had shifted, not just in them, but in me. That afternoon, I returned to the center like always. Same desk, same folders stacked high, same copy machine ticking in the background. But Angela stood waiting for me at the door. She didn't say, "You did great." She simply placed her hand on my shoulder and said softly, "You just took a step most people never dare to." I smiled, a smile that no longer held tears. That night, back in my little room, I pulled out the red notebook, the one I had once written in during freezing nights filled with fear. And on the last page I wrote, "I'm not anyone's voice, but if someone the world tried to forget can finally be heard, then I will not stop." About 2 weeks after the city council hearing, I got a text from an unknown number. It was short, polite, and completely bewildering. We'd like to invite Ms. V to speak at the upcoming Regional Community Development Conference in Philadelphia. Hoping to connect soon. I stared at the screen for nearly 5 minutes, convinced they had the wrong person. Me, the girl who once knocked on doors for free meals. Me, who'd curled up in bus stops through winter nights. I didn't reply. I slipped the phone into my pocket and kept filing paperwork like every other afternoon at the center. But Angela noticed something. She tilted her head and asked, "What's going on?" I showed her the message, said nothing. She just smiled, like she'd seen it coming all along. "V," she said, "sometimes things find us not because we're ready, but because we've lived too truthfully to be ignored." I didn't respond. I wasn't used to being invited to anything. For years, I had existed at the edges, the background worker, the quiet helper, the one who lifted others but never held the mic. That night, I thought hard. I opened the red notebook and flipped through old pages, scribbles from a girl who once believed she was never enough, not strong enough, not smart enough, not anything enough. Then I found a line I'd written months earlier in a darker pen than usual. "Don't be afraid to be seen. The worst thing is to live your whole life and never be known." I wrote back, "I'd be honored to join. Please send more details." The conference took place in a cultural center in downtown Philadelphia. When I arrived, it was raining lightly. There was no red carpet, no cameras, just people from different places, carrying stories the world had once dismissed. The meeting room was modest. Plastic chairs arranged in a semicircle, a small stage with a whiteboard and a basic microphone. But inside that room, I felt something rare: respect. Some were social workers, some were community nurses. One had served time for telling the truth. They weren't flashy, but every word they spoke held the room in breathless stillness. I was the final speaker of the day. When my name was announced, a few people clapped softly. No one really knew who I was, just that I had spoken up once in Pittsburgh, and the room had gone quiet. I walked up. My heart was pounding, but my voice, it was steady, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. "My name is V," I began. "I hold no academic titles, no official role. I'm just someone who was pushed out of her own home and had to learn to rebuild herself from what was left." I told my story, no embellishments, no pity, just truth. About the first night on a freezing bench, the first hand that held mine not out of pity but understanding. About the immigrants I'd helped translate for, people no one remembered by name, but who would never forget how they were treated. The room went still. And then I ended with something I'd never said out loud before. I used to think I was invisible, but in the dark, I learned how to shine in my own way. As I stepped off the stage, a petite older woman grabbed my hand. She didn't say a word. Her eyes welled up as she looked at me, like I had just spoken something she had never dared to admit to anyone. After the session, a man approached me. He introduced himself as a representative from a state-level policy development group. "V," he said, "we're building a new community advisory board, and I think you should be a part of it." I smiled, automatically, then immediately replied, "I'm not that kind of person. I've never studied policy, never worked in politics." He shook his head. We're not looking for degrees. We're looking for lived experience and courage. I didn't answer right away. On the train ride home, I stared out the window as old brick buildings slipped by like memories. I was no longer the girl huddled on a night bus, unsure where she was going. Now, I was going back. Not to a hometown, but to a place where I had been chosen. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Maybe I'm not ready, but if my voice can help someone else avoid the silence I once lived through, then I'll learn how to keep going, even with shaking hands." I said yes, not because I felt ready, but because the thought of someone else deciding for the people I had once looked in the eye, held by the hand, and heard whisper through fear, was unbearable. My new title, Statewide Community Advisor on Immigration and Vulnerable Populations Policy. It sounded big, and it was big. The first day I walked into the government office in Harrisburg, I felt like I'd stepped into another world. Shiny elevators, carpeted halls, coffee from a chrome machine, nameplates with government logos. No one there had ever slept on a park bench. No one carried a notebook full of words that once kept them alive. I was the only one in the meeting room wearing a worn fabric coat and a backpack instead of a leather briefcase. The looks were polite, but curious. A few limp handshakes, a few knowing smiles that whispered, "Isn't she the one from that story?" They called me the powerful speaker. They didn't call me the girl whose mother once left a bag of clothes on the porch in silence. The first meeting opened with a policy report thicker than a dictionary. The language slid past my ears like wind. Budget reallocations, field indicators, strategic risk assessments. But near the end of the session, a proposal came up. Should we cut funding for legal aid in undocumented communities to offset the federal shortfall? The room went quiet. Then a suited man, the kind used to having the last word, said, "They're not legal citizens anyway. What obligation do we have?" I froze, looked around. No one pushed back. No one agreed. Just a dangerous silence. The kind I knew too well. The kind that kills hope without ever lifting a hand. I raised mine. "Excuse me, I need to say something." I kept my voice steady. "The people you're referring to, them, are the ones I've shared meals with, worked beside, listened to as they whispered small dreams, to stay, to work honestly, to raise their children in peace." The man arched a brow. "I understand your emotional point of view, but policy must remain practical." I took a breath, and for the first time, I felt my anger not as a burden, but as fuel. Emotional? No. This is practical, because if the government doesn't stand with the most vulnerable, what exactly is it for? Angela once told me, "Some rooms don't need the loudest voice. They need the first one brave enough to speak." That day, I was that first voice, even if it made the air heavy, even if some people avoided my gaze, even if one committee member later shook my hand without looking me in the eye. Weeks later, I started to see the shadows behind the spotlight. I received an anonymous email. "Know your place." There were calls that hung up the moment I answered. Text messages, polite on the surface, with very clear undertones. "V, Let's not let emotion compromise the board's credibility. I got it. They wanted me there, to check a diversity box, but they didn't really want me to change anything. I grew tired. Some nights, I sat in my office, staring at draft policies I couldn't bring myself to touch. I had once believed that getting into the room would make my voice louder. But the truth was, the deeper I went in, the clearer it became. They weren't afraid of me raising my voice. They just needed me too exhausted to keep speaking. One late night, after a brutal meeting, I took a bus back to Pittsburgh. I stopped by the old community center, the one where I used to wipe tables, listen to stories, and find the courage to write on a wall for the first time. Angela was still there. She was cutting paper for an art class with kids. I sat beside her in silence. After a while, I whispered, "Do you think I made a mistake, going into that room?" Angela looked up, calm as ever. "No. But remember, just because you've entered the room doesn't mean you have to stay at any cost." I looked at her, as if waking up from a long dream. She continued, "You went in to do what you believe is right, not to become a shadow of someone else's compromise." That night, I didn't sleep. For the first time in weeks, I wrote, "Power isn't walking into a polished room. Power is walking out when that room asks you to leave yourself behind." That week, I took 2 days off, not to rest, but to breathe, to literally exhale all the weight I'd been holding in. The meetings, the evasive words, the glances that quietly said I was being too emotional. I went back to the old community center and sat alone in the tiny storage room. The walls still smelled of aged wood. Sunlight slipped through the cracks in the door, just like the very first day I'd arrived. I opened the red notebook. Fresh page, blue ink. If I no longer belong in those powerful rooms, then maybe it's time to create one of my own. A place where I don't need to convince anyone that I deserve to exist. A place where truth isn't filed under inconvenient. Ideas began to surface, scattered but clear. A space for those left behind by the system. A community support model built not on credentials, but on lived experience. Not academic language, not policy jargon, just real stories. I called it the listening table, a table for those who've never been offered a seat. It started in an empty room behind the community center. Angela helped me reach out. The coordinator agreed to let me borrow the space, rent-free, for the first 3 months. The first table I brought in was an old student desk I'd found at a recycling yard. The wood was scratched, one leg broken. I wedged a brick under it, cleaned it up, and laid a pale blue cloth across the top. Then I printed a small sign. "What's a story you've never been able to tell?" No appointments, no press, no social media buzz, just me. Every Wednesday afternoon and Sunday morning, sitting there, ready to listen to anyone who walked in. No recordings, no judgment, no advice. Just listening. In the first week, 3 people came. An older woman shared that she had once been a private chef for a senator, until they found out she didn't have a green card. A 17-year-old boy told me he'd been expelled for behavioral issues, though he was simply dealing with PTSD after watching his father get detained. I just sat there, hands resting gently on the table, listening. No interruptions, no solutions. And when they left, each one said the same thing. Thank you, for not looking away. Word about the listening table spread fast. Not through headlines, but through whispers. People who had once been invisible told each other, quietly but earnestly, that place doesn't ask who you are. It only asks how long you've been unheard. By the second month, I began hosting open share circles. No speakers, no formal format. Each person had 5 minutes if they wanted, and if not, they could just sit, be present. At one gathering, a young woman named Marisol stood up, her voice shaking. I used to think my voice didn't matter, but today, for the first time, someone looked at me like I belonged in the room. The space went still, then a single clap, soft, then another, then all of us, clapping. Not because her words were polished, but because she dared to show up. That evening, I got a phone call from the State Policy Office, the place I once served as an advisor. Female voice. Polite tone. We've noticed you've missed the last 2 meetings. Are you considering stepping down? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, gently but clearly, I'm not stepping down. I'm just choosing not to keep standing in a room where my presence is for decoration, not for listening. Silence on the other end, then just one line. We're sorry to hear that. I smiled. I'm not. The following week, a local journalist came to the listening table, sent by someone who had sat with us before. She didn't ask for an interview. She just stayed for an hour, listening. Before she left, she handed me a slip of paper. I used to think journalism was about telling the world stories, but today, I realized I need to relearn how to listen to it. Thank you, V. I didn't become someone important, not in the traditional sense, no medals, no awards, no titles. But every week, at least one person walks through that worn wooden door, sits at the slightly tilted table, and shares a story they've never told before. And I believe that is changing the world, one voice at a time, one moment at a time. Part 7. When the past knocks, not to hurt, but to ask for a seat. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was wiping down the table, getting ready to close up, when I heard a soft knock. The door was still ajar. Outside, a light rain fell over the parking lot. I looked up and froze. Standing in the doorway, beneath a silver-grey raincoat, was Isabella, my sister. The girl who stood silently beside our father the day I was thrown out of the house. The one who had coldly sent a private video of mine to our parents, like an unspoken verdict. I stared at her face, now thinner, older than I remembered. Dark circles under her eyes, hair tangled, mud on her shoes. I couldn't tell if I was breathing or holding my breath. 10 seconds passed. Neither of us spoke. Then she finally said, "You still take in strangers, right?" I glanced at the old wooden table with the brick-propped leg, the sign still hanging crooked in the window. Everyone has a story that hasn't been heard. I nodded. Have a seat. Isabella took off her raincoat, folded it neatly, and placed it on the chair beside her. She no longer looked like the polished attorney I remembered. No pencil skirt, no heels. Just a woman. Tired, silent, clinging to the last shred of dignity. I didn't ask why she'd come. I just poured 2 cups of hot tea. She wrapped her hands around hers, fingers trembling slightly. Eventually she spoke. "Dad's gone." My heart paused, not because I still loved him, but because I had stopped thinking about him a long time ago. She continued, eyes fixed on the table. "Lung cancer. They caught it too late. Mum's still in New Jersey. She's not doing well." I said nothing, not because I didn't feel, but because I wasn't sure what I was feeling. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. "You have every right to be angry or silent." But I didn't come to explain myself. I came to tell the truth. I nodded gently. "Then tell it." She inhaled slowly. "I was jealous of you. Since we were kids, you had this thing. People listened to you without you even trying. I had to fight for recognition. And when you chose to live openly, to step outside the box our family built, I got scared." "Scared of what?" I asked. She gave a sad smile. "Scared you were right. And if you were right, then my entire life had been one long performance." I didn't reply. She went on. "After the scandal, after losing my job, my reputation, most of my friends, I didn't come here to ask you to rescue me. I just wanted to sit, once, at the table I know I never gave you a seat at." My throat tightened, not from pain, but because, for the first time, I saw her as a person, not a resume, not a courtroom presence, just a sister trying to make something right. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. If you'd rather I leave after this tea, I will. But if you'll let me, I'd like to help clean up on weekends, wipe tables, serve tea, no name tag. I just want to start again, even if it's just a little, in the place where you began from nothing." I looked at her for a long time. I remembered the 20-year-old girl standing on the porch, hands trembling as she held the bag our mother left out without a word. That girl had once gone numb, once hated, once believed forgiveness was impossible. But then I looked at where I was now. This table, these walls, the people who had told me stories they'd never told a soul. And I thought, if I can't offer a seat to the very person who once pushed me out, am I any different from the world I've been trying to change? I nodded. "Saturday, 9 a.m. Wear soft-soled shoes. The floor's slippery over there." She froze. Then quietly tears fell onto her hands wrapped around the cup of tea. We didn't hug. There was no teary reunion like in the movies. Just a warm cup of tea, a quiet nod, and a seat. This time, for real. Part 8. When a voice becomes an echo, some will try to silence it. By the end of March, the listening table entered its 6th month. What began as a single worn-out table in an empty room had now grown into 3 permanent sites. One at the old community centre, one in the city library, and one inside a small church on the east side of Pittsburgh, where the priest once said, "God doesn't need a grand house, just a place where people are allowed to be honest." Each session welcomed 30 to 50 people, not just to speak, but to listen. One time, A former immigration officer stood up and publicly apologized to a mother he once detained. Another time, a teenager who once robbed a supermarket with a knife knelt before his mother, who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. But then, as the voices inside those rooms began to reach beyond their walls, the outside world began to take notice. One morning in early April, I received an email from the office of Attorney Henry Calderon, a former senior associate from the Policy Council I once advised. The message was brief. We are interested in your listening table model and would like to propose a meeting to discuss potential expansion and policy collaboration. I couldn't believe it. Them, the ones who once called me too emotional, now wanted to collaborate. Angela, always the calm compass in my storm, simply smiled. If a community model makes people want to control it, then that means it has real power. I agreed to the meeting, not because I wanted to partner with them, but because I wanted to look them in the eyes. This time, as myself. The meeting took place in a polished, downtown office building, a world apart from the splintered table I sat at every day. They offered to fund the listening table, professional signage, statewide promotional videos, marketing teams. I asked, and in return, what do you want? Henry didn't answer right away. One of his assistants spoke instead. Just a light content review. Some of the stories involving law enforcement or government agencies could be misinterpreted by the public. I laughed. Misinterpreted? Or maybe they're finally being understood, and that scares you. The room went cold. I'm not selling seats, and I'm not filtering truth, I said, rising to my feet. Thanks for the coffee, but we're just fine with a table that's cracked, propped up with bricks, and covered in a hand-washed cloth. I walked out. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but because I knew, from that moment on, I had become a thorn. 2 weeks later, the listening table was set to host its biggest public gathering yet, in the city's Central Park. Nearly 500 people had registered. Dozens of stories were submitted ahead of time to be shared aloud. This wasn't a small community circle anymore. This was a stage for those once pushed to the margins, to step center. And then, the night before the event, a note was slid under the community center's door. Know when to stop. Not everyone wants the past dug up. No signature, no number, just a reminder and a threat. I brought the note to Angela. She looked at it, sighed deeply, then said, "If you're scared, we can cancel. No one will blame you." I didn't answer immediately. Then I looked over at that familiar table, the one where I once sat with Isabella, with Marisol, with so many strangers whose faces I still remembered. I said, "No. If I back down now, then I'm still the girl who was kicked out at 20, believing she wasn't strong enough. Tomorrow, we move forward, not to confront, but to show this entire city that there's one thing that cannot be threatened. Truth told in the voices of those who were once silenced." Angela nodded. Her eyes glistened. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid the pale blue cloth across the table and wrote across it, in ink, "This is a place to listen, not to be silenced." Then I sat down, looking out the window. Streetlights poured across the wall, casting the shadow of one figure, me. No longer trembling, no longer shrinking, just one person, ready to keep a small flame from going out. That morning, the sky over Pittsburgh was unusually clear, as if after all the cold rains and heavy clouds, the city itself had decided to open up, to welcome something so true no one could look away anymore. The Central Park lawn had already been set up, tarps on the grass, chairs circling the edges, the sound system being tested for the third time. Volunteers wore light blue t-shirts with one simple line printed on the back. "I'm here to listen." Around 400 people were seated when I stepped up onto the small wooden platform, built from reclaimed lumber by our community crew over 2 long weeks. No stage lights, no news cameras. But every pair of eyes in that crowd shone brighter than any spotlight I'd ever stood under. I began. "Today is not a performance. No one here is the main character, because everyone has a story that's been dismissed. And if you carry a pain that has never been named, this space is for you." Applause, soft, steady, like a shared heartbeat. We began. Each person had 5 minutes. There was a sign-up list in advance, no interruptions, no pressure. A woman spoke about losing her child in an IC detention center. A man recounted being beaten by police after failing to show ID at a corner store. A teenage girl shared how she'd been forced into treatment simply for identifying as bisexual. Then came a name from the list. Isabella Mendez. "If you're ready, please come forward." I looked up. Isabella, my sister. She stepped onto the stage. No blazer, no case files, just her, wearing the same blue t-shirt as the volunteers, hair tied back, eyes slightly red. I knew she'd signed up to speak, but I didn't know what she planned to say. She held the mic with both hands and stood in silence for a long time. Then she began. "I used to be a prosecutor. I stood in courtrooms representing justice, and I thought that was enough. But I used that power not to protect, but to punish." The entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. 10 years ago, I handled a deportation case. A woman from Honduras, accused of association with criminal activity because she sent money back home to her brother. We had no real evidence, just an unverified internal report. But I chose to push that case forward. My heart pounded. I wanted to look away, but didn't. She was deported. Her daughter, a 9-year-old girl, attempted suicide shortly after. And I stayed silent. I left behind a cold line in a legal file, as if that were all I was responsible for. Isabella's voice broke. The park was silent, so quiet I could hear the wind in my ears. I'm not saying this to seek forgiveness, but because I can't keep standing at events like these, where people speak with courage, while I keep hiding the worst thing I've ever done. I no longer hold office. I've lost my title, my reputation. But if that mother, or someone representing her, wants to take legal action, I won't run. She bowed her head, then almost in a whisper, but perfectly clear. And if my sister, the one I betrayed, wants to remove my name from this table, she has every right. My vision blurred, not from anger, but because the wound she tore open in front of hundreds of strangers was one I had once carried in silence. After she stepped down, I walked back onto the platform. No one asked me to speak, but every eye turned toward me. I picked up the mic. I'm the sister of the woman who just spoke. She hurt me so deeply once that I thought I'd never heal. But today, I want to say this. We don't have to forgive right away. We don't have to forget. But truth, even when it comes late, still deserves to be heard. We didn't build this community to erase mistakes. We built it to face them, to lay them out, and say, this is a part of me, but it is not all of me. I looked at Isabella. Her eyes trembled, but did not look away. I nodded, not as a symbol of total forgiveness, but as a door, left slightly open. That afternoon, after the event ended, a small elderly woman with silver hair approached me. I'm the aunt of the Honduran woman your sister deported. My heart stopped. I lost contact with them after that. But hearing your sister speak today, I want to thank her, not because I've forgotten, but because I've learned that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a folding chair in a park, when someone has the courage to say, I was wrong. I didn't say a word. I just held her hand. And in that moment, I understood. The listening table isn't just where people come to tell their stories. It's a place where the past can be reopened without letting the present fall apart.